When three arrogant bandits swaggered onto a quiet Texas farm, they thought they'd found an easy target. What they didn't know was that the soft-spoken farmer they underestimated had a past that would send chills down their spines. By the time they realized who he truly was, it was already too late. Let me tell you why this confrontation would change their lives forever. The scorching Texas sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the dry, cracked earth of the sprawling Green Ridge farm. Its fields stretched endlessly, dotted with patches of hardy crops that stood resilient against the summer heat. At the heart of this land was a modest farmhouse with whitewashed walls, chipped from decades of wear, and a wide porch shaded by an ancient oak tree. On that porch sat a man who seemed as unassuming as the land itself. Henry Hank Callahan was a man of few words. At 62 years old, his leathery skin and silver-streaked hair told the story of a life spent battling the elements. Dressed in worn denim overalls and a simple white shirt rolled up to his elbows, he looked every bit the humble Texas farmer. But behind his calm exterior lay a history that not even his closest neighbors fully knew. Hank was a veteran of a war most had long forgotten, and a sharpshooter whose skill had once earned him the nickname Deadeye Callahan. Hank sat quietly, sipping his black coffee, his eyes scanning the horizon like they always did, a habit he'd never lost. His faithful Australian shepherd, Rusty, lay at his feet, ears perked, as if mirroring his owner's alertness. Life on the farm was peaceful, and Hank had no complaints. But peace, as he knew, was fragile. That morning, three unfamiliar figures approached the property. Their dust-covered boots crunched against the gravel driveway, and their laughter carried an edge of arrogance. They were dressed like drifters, wide-brimmed hats, leather vests, and pistols hanging conspicuously from their belts. The leader, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, stopped short of the porch and spat into the dirt. His name was Virgil Kane, and his reputation as a bandit preceded him. With him were his two lackeys, Slim, a wiry man with a crooked grin, and Clyde, whose sheer bulk seemed to overshadow his limited intelligence. Hank didn't move, only tilting his head slightly as his green eyes, piercing despite his age, sized them up. Rusty growled low, sensing the tension. Virgil stepped forward, his boots leaving deep impressions in the dust. "Well now, looks like we've found ourselves a quiet little place," Virgil drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's a man like you doing out here all alone, old-timer?" Hank took another sip of his coffee, his movements deliberate. "Minding my own business," he replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. "And I'd suggest you do the same." The bandits laughed, their voices loud and grating against the serene backdrop of the farm. Slim leaned forward, pointing at the crops. "Ain't much business to mind out here. Seems like you could use some help. Maybe the kind we can provide, for a price, of course." Hank placed his mug down on the porch rail, his gaze unwavering. "Don't need help," he said simply. Virgil's smile twisted into something darker. "Now, see, that's where you're wrong. Everybody needs a little protection. Otherwise, bad things can happen." Rusty growled again, louder this time, and Hank placed a steady hand on the dog's head. "You're trespassing," he said, his tone unchanged. "Turn around and leave. That's my advice." The bandits exchanged amused glances, their arrogance blinding them to the subtle warning in Hank's voice. Clyde cracked his knuckles, stepping forward. "And what if we don't, old man? You gonna make us?" Hank didn't flinch. His hand drifted lazily to the armrest of his chair, his movements as calm as ever. "You boys don't know what you're stepping into," he said, his voice low but carrying an edge that made Rusty's growl seem like a whisper. Virgil sneered, drawing closer. "I'll tell you what we know. You're an old farmer with no backup and no way to stop us. So why don't you—" Before Virgil could finish, Hank stood. The sudden movement silenced the bandits, though his frame was lean. The way he carried himself spoke volumes. It was as if the years fell away in an instant, and in his place stood a man honed by years of precision and discipline. His piercing gaze locked onto Virgil, and the air between them seemed to shift. "You've made your point," Hank said softly, stepping off the porch. "Now let me make mine." The bandits' confidence faltered for the first time as they noticed how Hank's hand hovered just a little too close to his side, where an old, well-kept revolver hung in its holster. The weapon, like its owner, was unassuming at first glance but held a legacy none of them were prepared for. The farm fell silent, except for the sound of Rusty's low growl and the faint rustling of the wind through the crops. The tension was palpable, and for the first time, the bandits began to question if they had underestimated the quiet man before them. The silence stretched across the farm like a taut rope, each second pulling the tension tighter. Hank stood a few paces away from the porch, his hand resting lightly near the worn leather of his holster. Rusty was by his side, his stance protective, teeth bared just enough to glint in the sunlight. The three bandits, who had swaggered onto the property with mockery in their voices, now exchanged uneasy glances. Virgil Kane, the leader, forced a chuckle to cut through the tension, though it sounded more like a bark. "Well now, ain't this something? The old man's got some spunk." He turned to his companions. "Boys, looks like we got ourselves a real show today." Clyde, the burly one, cracked his knuckles, his grin revealing crooked yellow teeth. "Show or not, we can handle him. He's just one man." Slim, on the other hand, wasn't laughing. His eyes darted from Hank to the revolver resting on his hip. The firearm looked older than Hank himself, but something about the way Hank's hand hovered near it sent a chill crawling up Slim's spine. Virgil stepped closer, his boots crunching the gravel with deliberate slowness. "You think that old piece is gonna scare us?" he said, nodding toward Hank's revolver. "You're outnumbered, old-timer. Why don't you just save yourself some trouble and hand over whatever cash you got stashed in that little farmhouse of yours?" Hank tilted his head, his expression unchanging. "I don't think you're hearing me. Leave now, and you can walk away with your pride. Stay, and things might not go the way you planned." Virgil scoffed. "You're bluffing. You might have been something back in the day, but now, you're just a dusty old farmer with a lot of bark and no bite." The faintest of smirks tugged at the corner of Hank's lips. "Try me." That was it. The moment the balance shifted, Virgil's bravado gave way to frustration. With a snarl, he nodded to Clyde, who lumbered forward like an ox preparing to charge. "Teach this old fool a lesson." Clyde cracked his neck, his meaty fists clenched, as he stepped closer to Hank. "You're gonna regret talking to us like that, old man." Hank didn't move. His green eyes locked onto Clyde's, calm and unyielding. He waited until the man was within striking distance, his every muscle coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike. In a blur of motion, Hank's hand snapped to his revolver. The sound of the hammer cocking echoed like a thunderclap, stopping Clyde dead in his tracks. The barrel of Hank's gun was pointed squarely at Clyde's chest, unwavering and steady as a steel bridge. "Take one more step and you won't take another," Hank said, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of decades of experience. Clyde froze, his bravado melting into confusion. He was big, strong, and used to intimidating his way through life, but something in Hank's eyes unnerved him. Those weren't the eyes of a frightened old farmer. They were the eyes of a predator who had seen far worse than Clyde could ever imagine. "Whoa, now," Virgil said, holding up his hands as if to defuse the situation. "No need to get trigger-happy, old man." Hank didn't lower his gun. "Rusty," he said sharply. The dog leapt forward, snarling and snapping at Clyde's legs, forcing the big man to stumble back with a startled yelp. Rusty herded Clyde back towards Slim and Virgil, standing his ground between them and Hank. "You've got one warning," Hank said, his tone icy. "Next time you won't get the chance to walk away." Slim, who had been inching toward his own gun, froze under Hank's gaze. "He's serious, Virgil," he muttered, his voice trembling. "This ain't just some old farmer." Virgil clenched his jaw, weighing his options. His pride told him to stand firm, to teach this man a lesson, but his instinct screamed that this was no ordinary standoff. "You're making a big mistake," Virgil said, his voice losing its edge. "You don't know who you're messing with." Hank finally lowered his gun, but the way he holstered it, fluid and precise, spoke volumes. "No, son," he replied. "You don't know who you're messing with." The wind rustled through the crops, carrying Hank's words across the silent farm. For a moment, it seemed the bandits might retreat, but Virgil, driven by wounded pride, wasn't ready to back down entirely. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But we're not done here. We'll be back, old man. And next time we won't be so friendly." Hank stepped back onto his porch, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Come back if you like," he said, settling back into his chair. "Just be ready for what you'll find." Rusty barked once, a sharp sound that sent the bandits retreating toward their horses. As they mounted and rode off, Virgil cast one last glare over his shoulder, silently vowing to make good on his threat. Hank watched them disappear into the horizon, his hand absently scratching behind Rusty's ears. He knew this wasn't the end, but he also knew he was ready for whatever came next. The war he'd left behind years ago wasn't over. Not yet. The day moved on, but the encounter lingered like a storm cloud over Hank's farm. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields as Hank prepared for the evening. He worked quietly, his movements deliberate, but his mind churned with thoughts of the bandits. Rusty stayed close, his ears twitching at every sound. The dog seemed to sense the tension in the air, mirroring Hank's vigilance. As the evening settled in, Hank moved to the barn to finish feeding the animals. The comforting sounds of shuffling hooves and the rustle of hay filled the space, but an uneasy stillness lay just beyond the barn doors. Hank couldn't shake the feeling that the bandits weren't gone for good. Men like Virgil Kane didn't take humiliation lightly. Hank had seen their type before, prideful, reckless, and dangerous when cornered. He also knew they wouldn't come back empty-handed. As he finished up, Hank paused at the barn door, looking out over his property. The distant tree line was bathed in the amber glow of the setting sun, but something about the scene felt wrong. He squinted, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. That's when he saw it, a faint plume of dust rising above the trees, moving toward the farm. Hank's jaw tightened. They were coming back, and it looked like they weren't alone. He stepped back into the barn, his hands moving with practiced precision. The weapons he'd kept hidden for years were still there, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked away in a corner. He unwrapped the rifle first, running his fingers over the cold steel. It was an older model, but Hank had kept it in pristine condition, just in case. Next came the revolver, a .45 Colt with a grip worn smooth from years of use. As he loaded the weapons, the memories came rushing back. Combat missions in foreign deserts, split-second decisions, the weight of life and death in his hands. He had left that life behind, but it seemed fate wasn't done with him yet. The sound of hooves on gravel pulled Hank from his thoughts. He peered through the small barn window and counted 6 riders, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. Virgil Kane rode at the front, his salt-and-pepper beard catching the last rays of sunlight. Beside him was Clyde, looking even more brutish with a shotgun slung across his back. Slim rode just behind them, his nervous energy almost palpable. 3 more men, equally rough-looking, brought up the rear. Hank let out a slow breath. He had hoped they wouldn't push their luck, but here they were, proving just how wrong he'd been. Rusty growled low in his throat, his hackles rising. "Easy, boy," Hank murmured, patting the dog's head. "We'll handle this." As the riders approached the farmhouse, Virgil dismounted with exaggerated care, as if mocking the quiet of the setting. He gestured for his men to do the same, and together they spread out, their movements calculated to intimidate. "Hank!" Virgil called, his voice carrying through the still evening air. "We're back, just like I said. Hope you've had time to think about what's good for you." Hank stepped out from the barn, his rifle resting casually in his hands. His presence alone was enough to halt the bandits in their tracks. Even in the dim light, there was an unmistakable authority in his stance, a quiet warning that none of them missed. "I told you to stay away," Hank said, his tone even but firm. "You had your chance to leave this place with your heads held high. You didn't take it." Virgil smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And you think you can stop us? Look around, old man. It's 6-1. Hank's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "You should have brought more." The words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in quiet confidence. For a moment, the bandits hesitated, the weight of Hank's reputation pressing down on them like a physical force. Slim shuffled nervously, his hand hovering near his holster, but Virgil barked a command to keep him in check. "You think you're untouchable because you were somebody once," Virgil said, stepping closer. "But time catches up with everyone. You're just an old man clinging to memories." Hank took a step forward, his rifle steady in his hands. "You're right," he said. "Time does catch up with everyone. Looks like it's caught up with you tonight." Before Virgil could respond, Rusty's growl deepened, a warning of the danger just moments away. Hank's words weren't empty. They were a prelude to the storm he was about to unleash. The tension broke like a snapped wire as the bandits drew their weapons. Hank moved with a speed and precision that belied his age, his rifle firing before any of them could react. The first shot struck the ground at Virgil's feet, scattering gravel and forcing him to stumble back. "Next one doesn't miss," Hank said, his voice a calm promise. The bandits froze, their earlier bravado replaced by the dawning realization that they had severely underestimated their opponent. The stillness that followed Hank's warning shot was deafening. The bandits, who had arrived with laughter and cocky swagger, now stood rooted in place, their earlier confidence crumbling like dry leaves. Virgil Kane's hand hovered near his revolver, his eyes darting between Hank and the men behind him. The smirk he had worn so easily was now replaced by a grim set to his jaw. Clyde, who prided himself on being the muscle of the group, took a half-step forward, his fists clenched. "You're bluffing, old man," he growled. Though the quaver in his voice betrayed his uncertainty, Hank didn't flinch. His green eyes locked on Clyde with a calm intensity that was more unnerving than any shout. "Son," Hank said evenly, "if I wanted you on the ground, you'd already be there. Don't test me." Slim shifted uneasily, the barrel of Hank's rifle still etched in his mind. He whispered harshly to Virgil, "Boss, this ain't worth it. Look at him. He ain't scared." Virgil shot him a glare. "Shut your mouth." But even Virgil couldn't deny the creeping doubt. Something about Hank, the way he moved, the way he handled his weapon, felt all wrong for a simple farmer. "Here's what's going to happen," Hank said, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "You're going to take your boys and leave my land. You're going to keep riding until I can't see the dust from your horses, and you're not going to come back." Rusty growled low, his stance rigid and his teeth bared. The dog's loyalty was absolute, and his presence only added to the sense of danger emanating from Hank. Virgil chuckled, though it was a hollow sound. "You think you're the law out here. We've taken down plenty of men tougher than you. You're just one man." Hank's lips twitched in a faint smile. "I've been just one man in worse places than this." Slim's unease was growing by the second. "Virgil, we should go. He ain't normal. He's got that look." "What look?" Virgil snapped. Slim hesitated, searching for the words. "The look of a man who's done things he don't talk about. The kind of man who don't bluff." Clyde glanced at Slim, his earlier bravado wavering. "He's just an old man with a lucky shot. We can take him." "You want to test that theory?" Hank asked, his tone carrying no malice, just cold certainty. The standoff stretched on, the tension thick as the humid Texas night. Then Virgil's pride got the better of him. He took a deliberate step forward, his hand finally closing around the grip of his revolver. "You've had your say, farmer," he spat. "Now let's see if you can back it up." The second Virgil moved, Hank reacted. His rifle rose with the speed of a striking snake, the barrel trained on Virgil's chest in an instant. Virgil froze, his hand halfway to drawing his weapon. "Don't!" Hank said, the single word carrying a weight that stopped Virgil cold. Clyde growled in frustration. "You can't take all of us. You might get one, maybe two, but the rest of us will put you in the ground." Hank tilted his head, considering the statement. Then he lowered his rifle, setting it against the porch rail. The bandits exchanged glances, confused by the sudden move. "What's this?" Virgil sneered. "Giving up." Hank unbuckled his holster, letting his revolver fall into his hand. He held it loosely at his side as he stepped off the porch, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You want to see what happens when you push a man too far," Hank said quietly. "I'll show you." Clyde smirked, mistaking Hank's calm for weakness. He cracked his knuckles. Finally, a fair fight. Hank didn't respond. He simply raised his revolver and fired. The shot wasn't aimed to kill, but it clipped Clyde's belt, sending his gun skittering into the dirt. The big man staggered back, clutching his side as if he'd been hit. "You've got 3 seconds to pick up your friend and leave," Hank said, his voice low and measured. 3. Clyde stared at him, wide-eyed and furious, but he didn't move. Rusty barked sharply, his hackles raised, ready to leap if needed. 2, Hank said, his gaze sweeping over the group. Slim took a step back, his hands raised. "Virgil," Slim said nervously. "Let's go, he's serious." Virgil clenched his teeth, his pride warring with his survival instinct. Finally, he spat into the dirt and motioned to Clyde. "Get up, we're leaving." Clyde hesitated, then scrambled to his feet, keeping a wary eye on Hank. One by one, the bandits backed toward their horses, their arrogance stripped away. "This ain't over," Virgil said, his voice tight with anger. Hank raised his revolver again, the barrel trained on Virgil's heart. It is if you're smart. The bandits mounted their horses and rode off into the night, their silhouettes swallowed by the darkness. Hank stood still, watching until the last sound of hoofbeats faded. Only then did he lower his gun. Rusty trotted to his side, wagging his tail. "Good boy," Hank said, scratching the dog behind the ears. "Now let's see if they're dumb enough to come back." The morning after the confrontation, Hank rose early, the Texas sun painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The air was thick with the scent of wildflowers and dew-damp earth, but the events of the previous night weighed heavily on his mind. He leaned against the porch rail, sipping his coffee as Rusty lay at his feet, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Hank's gaze drifted toward the barn, where his old truck was parked. The engine needed fixing, and there were fences to mend and fields to plow. The land demanded his attention, but something about the bandits' retreat nagged at him. Men like Virgil Kane didn't just walk away, they regrouped, licked their wounds and returned with a vengeance. He glanced toward the dirt road leading into town, a narrow strip that wound through rolling fields. For years, that road had been a symbol of connection, a link to neighbors, supplies, and the occasional town gathering. Now, it felt like a thread of vulnerability, an open door to trouble. "Hank!" The voice of his neighbor, Clara Dawson, broke through his thoughts. She was jogging up the path, her face flushed with urgency. Clara was in her early 50s, her hands calloused from years of ranch work, but her spirit was as fierce as any gunslinger. "I saw them," she panted, stopping short of the porch. "Saw who?" Hank asked, setting his coffee down. "Virgil and his crew, they're camped out near the old Miller property." She wiped her brow with the back of her hand. "They've been asking around about you. It doesn't sound good." Hank nodded, the confirmation settling like a stone in his chest. "I figured as much." Clara frowned. "What are you going to do? You know they'll come back." Hank's expression hardened. "If they do, they'll find out the hard way why they shouldn't have." Clara hesitated, then stepped closer. "Hank, you're good, but you're one man. If they bring reinforcements—" "I've handled worse," Hank interrupted, his voice calm but resolute. "But I appreciate you letting me know." Clara's eyes searched his face for a moment before she sighed. "Just don't try to do everything alone, all right? There are folks around here who'd stand with you if it came to that." Hank offered her a faint smile. "I'll keep that in mind." As Clara departed, Rusty barked softly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Hank followed the dog's line of sight and saw a plume of dust rising in the distance. His grip tightened on the porch rail. Visitors, and from the looks of it, they were in a hurry. Minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the house, the engine purring like a predator. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man in a tailored suit that seemed as out of place as a snowstorm in July. His polished shoes crunched against the gravel as he approached. "Hank Monroe?" the man asked, his voice smooth and professional. Hank eyed him warily. "Depends who's asking." The man extended a hand. "Name's William Harlan. I work for the Texas Land and Agricultural Association. We're looking into some irregularities in this area." "Irregularities," Hank repeated, not taking the offered hand. Harlan withdrew it with a practiced smile. "Yes, we've received reports of trespassing, intimidation, and potential land disputes. I understand you had an encounter with a certain Virgil Kane last night." Hank's eyes narrowed. "How do you know about that?" "We have our ways," Harlan replied smoothly. "Virgil and his crew have been causing problems all over the region. We're compiling evidence to build a case against them, but we can't do it without cooperation from folks like you." Hank crossed his arms. "And what's your angle in all this? You don't look like the kind of man who gets his hands dirty unless there's a payday involved." Harlan chuckled. "You're sharp, Mr. Monroe. Yes, the association has interests in protecting its members, but I'm also here to ensure justice is served. Men like Virgil thrive because good people stay silent." Hank studied him for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" "Testimony, for starters," Harlan said. "And if you've got any evidence, witnesses, recordings, anything that ties them to illegal activity, it could make a world of difference." Hank's jaw tightened. "I'll think about it." Harlan nodded, slipping a business card from his pocket and placing it on the porch rail. "Fair enough, but don't think too long. Men like Virgil don't wait for permission to strike back." As Harlan returned to his car, Rusty growled softly, sensing Hank's unease. Hank picked up the card, turning it over in his hand. It bore the association's logo and Harlan's contact information, but it felt heavier than paper, as if it carried the weight of a decision he wasn't ready to make. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Hank stood at the edge of his property, staring out at the distant hills. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the promise of another storm. This time, though, it wasn't the weather he feared. Night fell over the Monroe farm, and the quiet was both a comfort and a burden to Hank. The land stretched endlessly before him, bathed in moonlight, the familiar landscape now shadowed with uncertainty. He leaned against the fence post near the barn, his thoughts spiraling as he considered the storm brewing around him. Rusty whined softly, nudging Hank's leg, sensing his unease. Hank knelt down, scratching the dog behind the ears. "You've been through a lot with me, haven't you, boy?" Rusty's tail wagged, but his eyes were serious, mirroring Hank's mood. The memory of Harlan's visit earlier that day replayed in Hank's mind. The man's polished words and confident demeanor had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Trust didn't come easily, not after everything Hank had seen and survived. The thought of testifying, of stepping into a world of lawyers and courtrooms, felt like a betrayal of the quiet life he'd fought so hard to build. But then there was Virgil Kane and his gang. Clara's warning and Harlan's visit had confirmed what Hank already knew. These men wouldn't back down. They'd return, angrier and more dangerous, and it wouldn't just be Hank's fight. His neighbors, his community, they were all at risk. He couldn't stand by and let that happen. The faint sound of gravel crunching under tires pulled Hank from his thoughts. A lone pickup truck approached, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Hank straightened, his hand instinctively brushing against the revolver holstered at his hip. The truck came to a stop, and the door opened to reveal Clara Dawson. She stepped out, her face set with determination, a rifle slung over her shoulder. "Figured you could use some backup," she said, her voice firm but kind. Hank raised an eyebrow. "You know what kind of trouble this could bring you." Clara shrugged. "I've seen trouble before, besides this is my home too. If you think I'm going to sit back while some outlaws try to take it from us, you don't know me as well as you think." Hank allowed a small smile to break through his serious expression. "Fair enough, but it's not just them we've got to worry about. That man from the association stopped by today. Wants me to testify against Virgil." Clara's eyes narrowed. "And you're thinking about it?" "I don't know," Hank admitted. "Feels like inviting more trouble than it's worth." Clara crossed her arms, her voice softening. "Hank, you've been through more than most people can imagine, but this isn't just about you anymore. If standing up to those men keeps them from hurting anyone else, maybe it's worth the risk." Hank looked away, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "I spent years fighting other people's battles, Clara. Came back here to get away from all that. I don't know if I've got it in me to start another war." Clara stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Maybe it's not about starting a war. Maybe it's about finishing one." Hank met her eyes, and for a moment they stood in silence, the weight of their shared resolve hanging between them. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but if we're doing this, we're doing it smart. No unnecessary risks." Clara smiled. "Wouldn't expect anything less from you." As they spoke, a shadow moved at the edge of the property near the tree line. Rusty growled low in his throat, his body tense. Hank followed the dog's gaze and spotted the faint glint of moonlight on metal. He gestured for Clara to stay behind him, his hand resting on his revolver as he stepped forward. "Who's there?" Hank called, his voice steady but commanding. A figure emerged from the shadows, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. It was a young man, barely out of his teens, with a face marked by desperation and fear. He wore a tattered jacket, and a pistol dangled loosely from his belt. "Don't shoot!" the boy stammered. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Hank kept his weapon ready, but didn't draw. "Then you'd better start explaining why you're sneaking around my property in the dead of night." The boy hesitated, his gaze darting between Hank and Clara. I was part of Virgil's crew, but I didn't sign up for this. I didn't know he was going to go after people like you." Hank's eyes narrowed. "Why are you here?" "I want out," the boy said, his voice cracking. "But you don't just leave a gang like Virgil's. I figured maybe you could help me." Hank exchanged a glance with Clara, who gave a slight nod. "What's your name, son?" "Eli," the boy replied. "Eli Turner." Hank studied him for a moment, weighing the risk. Finally, he motioned toward the barn. "All right, Eli. Let's talk." Inside the barn, Hank lit a lantern, its warm glow illuminating the weathered wooden walls and casting long shadows over the hay-strewn floor. Eli sat on an overturned crate, fidgeting nervously as Rusty lay nearby, his watchful eyes never leaving the young man. Clara leaned against a support beam, her rifle resting at her side. "All right, Eli," she began, her tone firm but not unkind. "If you want help, you need to start talking. What's Virgil planning?" Eli hesitated, rubbing his hands together. "He's mad, real mad. Said he ain't gonna let some washed-up farmer make him look weak." Hank leaned against the workbench, his arms crossed. "How many men's he got?" "About 10, maybe 12, Eli answered. "Most of 'em ain't much more than bullies with guns. But Virgil, he's different. Smart, mean, and he's got connections." "Connections to what?" Hank pressed. Eli swallowed hard. "To people who don't like the law getting in their business. Smugglers, maybe worse. I heard him talking about bringing in reinforcements if things get ugly." Clara exchanged a glance with Hank, her expression grim. "Sounds like he's not planning to back down." "No, ma'am," Eli said, shaking his head. "He's coming here tomorrow night. Said he's going to make an example out of you." The barn fell silent, the weight of Eli's words settling over them. Hank's jaw tightened as he turned his gaze toward the lantern's flickering flame. "Tomorrow night," he murmured. "That gives us a day to prepare." "Prepare for what?" Clara asked. Hank straightened, his voice steady and resolute. "For whatever Virgil brings. If he wants a fight, he'll get one." Eli's eyes widened in alarm. "You don't know what he's capable of. He doesn't just want to scare you. He wants to destroy you." Hank's green eyes locked onto Eli's, calm yet unyielding. "Let him try." Clara stepped forward. "Hank, you can't do this alone." "I won't be," he replied. "But I'm not dragging the whole town into this. It's my fight." "It's not just your fight," Clara shot back. "You heard him. He's not stopping with you. If we don't take a stand, he'll keep going." Eli's voice trembled as he spoke. "There's more. He's got dynamite." Both Hank and Clara turned to him, their faces registering the new threat. "Dynamite," Clara echoed. Eli nodded. "He said he'd use it if he had to. Said he'd blow this place sky high if you didn't give in." Hank exhaled sharply, his mind racing. The stakes had just been raised, and the margin for error had disappeared. "Clara, we'll need to fortify the property, lock down anything that can catch fire and block off easy access points." "Eli, you're gonna help." "Me?" Eli asked, his voice cracking. Hank stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You want out of Virgil's gang? You start by proving you're not like them. You help me protect this farm." Eli nodded reluctantly. "All right. What do you need me to do?" "We'll start with the perimeter," Hank said, motioning toward the door. "Set up barriers, lay traps if we have to. Clara, check the ammunition stash in the house. Make sure we've got enough." As they moved to leave the barn, Clara stopped and turned back to Hank. "What about the law? Shouldn't we call someone?" Hank shook his head. "No time. By the time they get here, it'll be over. We handle this ourselves." Eli hesitated at the threshold, his eyes darting nervously toward the darkened landscape. "What if they're already watching?" "They probably are," Hank admitted. "But that works both ways. Let 'em see we're not scared." The trio spent the next several hours preparing the property. Hank and Eli worked in tense silence, setting up makeshift barricades and securing weak points around the farm. Clara checked and reloaded every weapon they had, her resolve growing stronger with each passing moment. As dawn approached, the air seemed charged with anticipation. The farm, once a picture of tranquility, now resembled a fortress. Hank stood on the porch, surveying their work with a critical eye. Rusty sat at his feet, ears pricked and alert. Clara joined him, exhaustion etched on her face. "We've done all we can," she said quietly. Hank nodded. "Now we wait." In the distance, the faint sound of engines broke the pre-dawn stillness. Clara tensed, gripping her rifle. "They're coming." Hank's expression hardened, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "Let 'em come." The sun rose sluggishly over the horizon, its rays casting long, jagged shadows across the farm. Hank, Clara, and Eli gathered on the porch, the weight of the coming confrontation hanging heavy in the crisp morning air. The night's preparations had fortified the farm, But as the sound of distant engines grew louder, the tension thickened like a storm cloud. Hank adjusted his hat, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the tree line. "Eli," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "What else do we need to know about Virgil's men? Who's coming with him?" Eli hesitated, the weight of his betrayal evident in his trembling hands. "Virgil doesn't just bring the usual thugs for something like this. He's got a guy named Red on his side, a sharpshooter. Best shot I've ever seen." "Better than me," Clara interjected, her tone sharp, challenging. Eli glanced at her, unsure how to answer. "Maybe. He's fast, and he doesn't miss." Clara exchanged a look with Hank, her jaw tightening. "So I guess we'll see about that. What else?" Hank pressed. "There's Buck," Eli continued, shifting uncomfortably. "He's the muscle. Big as a bear and twice as mean. He doesn't think, just does what Virgil says." Hank nodded, filing away the information. "And the dynamite," Eli swallowed hard. "Virgil keeps it with him. He won't use it right away, but if he thinks he's losing, he won't hesitate." Clara frowned. "He's bringing it here. Isn't that risky for him?" Eli shrugged. "Virgil's not the kind of man who worries about risks. He likes having the upper hand." Hank's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we take that upper hand away." The sound of engines grew louder, the low rumble vibrating through the earth. Rusty barked sharply, his ears pinned back as he paced the porch. Clara raised her rifle, checking the sights one last time. "They're close." Hank turned to Eli. "You stay out of sight. If things go south, you know where the cellar is. Don't come out until it's safe." Eli hesitated, then nodded. I'm sorry," he said quietly. Hank rested a hand on the young man's shoulder, his grip firm. "You made your choice. Now stand by it." Eli slipped into the house, leaving Hank and Clara alone on the porch. The first of Virgil's men came into view, their trucks kicking up dust as they rolled down the dirt road. 3 vehicles, each packed with armed men, came to a halt just outside the gate. The lead truck's door opened, and Virgil stepped out, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure in the morning light. Virgil's voice boomed across the farm. "Morning, Hank! Thought I'd pay you a visit." Hank stepped off the porch, his boots crunching against the gravel. "So you've been visiting enough folks lately, Virgil. Thought I'd save you the trouble of breaking my door." Virgil chuckled, his grin sharp and humorless. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Clara appeared at Hank's side, her rifle slung across her shoulder. "He's not outnumbered." Virgil's grin faltered briefly before returning, though the spark of unease in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. "Clara," he said smoothly, "still playing sheriff on this dusty old farm?" "Somebody has to," she replied coolly. "You boys get lost, or do we need to show you the way?" Virgil's men laughed, a low, derisive sound that made Clara's blood boil. Hank held up a hand, silencing her before she could say more. "Let's get to the point, Virgil. You came here for something." "I came to teach you a lesson," Virgil said, his voice hardening. "You don't say no to me, Hank. Nobody does." Hank's eyes never wavered. "I guess there's a first time for everything." Virgil gestured to his men, who began spreading out, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. Clara tensed, her fingers tightening around her rifle. "Careful now," Virgil warned. "We wouldn't want this to get messy." Hank smiled faintly, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Messy? Virgil, I haven't even started cleaning up yet." Before Virgil could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the air. One of the men near the gate cried out, clutching his leg as he dropped to the ground. Clara lowered her rifle, a satisfied smirk on her face. "Guess Red's not the only one who doesn't miss." The laughter among Virgil's men stopped abruptly, replaced by shouts of alarm as they scrambled for cover. Virgil's grin disappeared entirely, replaced by a snarl. "You're making a big mistake, Hank." "No," Hank said evenly. "You are." From the barn, Eli watched the scene unfold, his heart pounding. He knew the stakes were higher than he had imagined, but as he saw Hank and Clara stand their ground, a flicker of hope ignited within him. The farm erupted into chaos as Virgil's men dove for cover behind their trucks, barking orders and shouting threats. Hank stood his ground near the porch, his hand resting calmly on the revolver holstered at his hip. Clara knelt beside the porch railing, her rifle trained on the gang, her sharp eyes scanning for movement. Virgil's voice roared above the commotion. "You've gone and done it now, Hank. You think one lucky shot's enough to scare us off?" Hank didn't flinch. "Luck's got nothing to do with it, Virgil. But if you want to see just how unlucky you can get, step a little closer." Rusty barked furiously. His hackles raised as the tension reached its breaking point. One of Virgil's men, a wiry figure with a scar running down his cheek, peeked around the side of the truck, his shotgun aimed at the house. Before he could fire, Clara's rifle cracked again, the bullet striking the ground inches from his feet. He yelped, retreating behind the truck. "Next one won't miss," Clara warned, her voice cold and steady. Virgil's second in command, the burly and intimidating Buck, leaned out from behind cover, his shotgun poised. "Boss, we can take 'em. They're just two people." Virgil raised a hand to silence him, his sharp eyes fixed on Hank. "Don't underestimate them, Buck. This ain't their first fight." Hank's voice rang out, calm but laced with authority. "You're right about that, Virgil. And if you keep pushing, it might be your last." The standoff stretched into a tense silence, the farm eerily quiet except for the occasional creak of the windmill and the distant call of a crow. Every man on both sides held their breath, waiting for someone to make the next move. Eli crouched in the shadows of the barn, watched with a mixture of fear and awe. He had never seen anyone stand up to Virgil like this, let alone two people against a dozen armed men. His hands trembled as he gripped the rifle Hank had handed him earlier, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Suddenly, Red, the infamous sharpshooter Virgil had brought along, emerged from the far side of a truck, his rifle glinting in the sunlight. He dropped to one knee, his sights trained on Clara. Hank noticed him immediately, his sharp instincts kicking in. "Clara, down!" Hank shouted. Clara dove to the side just as Red fired, the bullet splintering the wooden railing where she had been moments before. She rolled to her feet, her rifle coming up as she returned fire. The shot grazed Red's shoulder, making him cry out and retreat behind the truck. "That all you got, Red?" Clara taunted, her voice cutting through the air. "I expected more from someone with your reputation," Red snarled, clutching his shoulder. "You're gonna regret that, little girl." Hank stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Virgil, call off your men. You know this ends one way," Virgil sneered. "You think you can win this, Hank? You're outnumbered, outgunned." Hank's eyes narrowed. "Numbers don't mean much when you're up against someone who knows how to use the land." As if on cue, a loud cracking sound echoed from the fence line. One of Virgil's men, trying to circle around the property, triggered a hidden tripwire, sending him sprawling into a patch of thorny bushes. He screamed in pain, struggling to free himself as the thorns tore at his skin. "You rigged the place!" Virgil spat, his fury evident. "Didn't leave much choice," Hank replied. "You brought this on yourself," Buck growled, his patience snapping. "Enough of this." He stepped out from behind the truck, his shotgun raised. Before he could fire, Clara's rifle barked, the bullet striking the ground near his feet. Buck hesitated, his bravado wavering. "You're faster than I thought," he muttered, retreating. Virgil's frustration boiled over. "Fine. You want a fight? Let's finish this." He motioned to his men, and chaos erupted. Gunfire rang out, bullets tearing through the air as the gang made their move. Hank and Clara worked in tandem, their shots precise and calculated. Each bullet found its mark, forcing Virgil's men to retreat further behind their trucks. Eli, still hidden in the barn, clenched his teeth as he watched the firefight. His hands shook, but he knew he couldn't stay in the shadows forever. Taking a deep breath, he aimed his rifle at one of the gang members who was sneaking toward the house. Summoning all his courage, he fired. The shot hit its mark, grazing the man's arm and causing him to drop his weapon. Eli ducked back into the barn, his heart pounding, but a surge of pride coursed through him. He had done it. He had fought back. Virgil's voice roared once more. "You're going to regret this, Hank. Every last one of you." Hank, calm as ever, responded. "The only regret here is yours, Virgil, for thinking you could come here and leave without a fight." The chaos at the farm had reached its peak. Gunfire echoed across the fields, mingling with the shouts and curses of Virgil's gang as they desperately tried to regain control of the situation. Dust and smoke filled the air, adding an almost apocalyptic feel to the battleground. Despite the overwhelming odds, Hank and Clara held their ground with a composure that only years of experience and grit could provide. Virgil crouched behind one of the trucks, his face contorted in frustration and rage. His men were scattered, their confidence waning under Hank and Clara's precise counterattacks. Even Red, his prized sharpshooter, had been neutralized, clutching his bleeding shoulder and glaring at Clara from behind the engine block of the pickup. "Damn it, regroup!" Virgil bellowed, his voice raw with fury. "We're not losing to a couple of farmers." Clara smirked from her position by the porch, her rifle steady as she scanned for movement. "Farmers? That's cute. Let me show you what a real farmer can do." She fired again, the bullet shattering the side mirror of the truck Virgil was using for cover. The glass shards sprayed into his face, and he ducked lower with a furious snarl. From the barn, Eli peeked out cautiously, his rifle still clutched tightly in his trembling hands. He had never been in a real fight before, but something inside him had shifted. He was tired of being afraid, tired of watching others fight his battles. Taking another deep breath, he moved along the shadows, inching closer to the action. Virgil's second-in-command, Buck, made his move, charging toward the porch with his shotgun raised. Clara spotted him instantly and fired, but Buck was quick, dropping low and rolling behind the old water trough. He popped up, his shotgun aimed directly at her. "Hank!" Clara shouted as she ducked, just as Buck fired. The shot hit the railing above her, sending splinters flying. She rolled to the side, raising her rifle to return fire, but Hank was already on the move. With a speed that belied his years, Hank drew his revolver and fired twice. The first shot struck Buck's shotgun, knocking it out of his hands, while the second grazed his thigh, sending him sprawling to the ground. Buck howled in pain, clutching his leg. You old bastard!" Hank stepped forward, his revolver still aimed at Buck. "You came to my land, threatening my family. Be glad I'm giving you a chance to crawl out of here alive." Virgil saw the confrontation and knew he was losing control of the situation. He signaled to the remaining gang members, yelling, "Flank them! Get behind the house!" Two of the outlaws broke off and started circling toward the rear of the property, thinking they could catch Hank and Clara off guard. What they didn't know was that Hank had anticipated this move. He had spent the night before laying traps and securing the perimeter, turning his farm into a fortress. As the outlaws approached the back door, a hidden tripwire triggered a small explosion, sending a cloud of dirt and debris into the air. The men stumbled, disoriented, and Clara took advantage of the chaos, picking them off with two well-placed shots. Eli, now positioned closer to the action, spotted another gang member trying to climb through the barn window. Summoning every ounce of courage, he raised his rifle and fired. The bullet struck the man's arm, causing him to lose his grip and fall to the ground. Eli stepped out of the shadows, his heart racing but his resolve firm. "Not bad for a kid," Clara called out from the porch, her voice carrying a note of pride. "Keep it up, Eli." Hank turned his attention back to Virgil, who was now standing, his pistol drawn. The two men locked eyes across the yard, the years of history between them hanging heavy in the air. "This ends now, Virgil," Hank said, his voice calm but unyielding. "Call off your men and leave, or this won't end well for you." Virgil laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You think you've won, old man? You think taking me down will change anything? There's always someone else ready to take my place." Hank's grip on his revolver tightened. "Maybe, but they won't be you. And they'll know what happens when you mess with the wrong people." The tension was palpable as the two men faced off. Around them, the remaining gang members hesitated, their confidence shattered. The once mighty force of the outlaws had been reduced to a handful of frightened men, their leader now standing alone against the unwavering determination of Hank and Clara. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. The stage was set for the final confrontation, the moment that would decide the fate of everyone involved. The yard fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the faint creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. Virgil stood his ground, his pistol gripped tightly in his hand. His chest heaved, anger and desperation etched across his face. Hank, standing firm on the porch steps, kept his revolver steady, his calm demeanor unshaken by the tension crackling in the air. "Last chance, Virgil," Hank said, his voice low and steady. "Walk away while you still can." Virgil's eyes darted around the farm, taking in the devastation. His men were scattered, their weapons abandoned or clutched in trembling hands. Clara's rifle remained trained on him, unwavering, and Eli stood by the barn, his grip on the rifle steady, despite the sweat dripping down his face. "You think you've beaten me, Hank?" Virgil spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You don't know what's coming. You can't fight the whole world." Hank's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "I don't need to fight the world, just you." Virgil's hand twitched, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. Hank's sharp eyes caught the movement, and with a reflex honed by years of experience, he moved first. His revolver barked, the shot splitting the tense silence. Virgil's gun flew from his hand as the bullet struck true, sending him reeling backward with a cry of pain. Clara shifted her aim instantly, covering the remaining gang members who now stood frozen, their will to fight completely gone. "Anyone else want to test their luck?" she called out, her voice sharp and cold. The outlaws exchanged nervous glances, their bravado evaporating under the weight of their losses. One by one, they began to drop their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. Hank descended the porch steps slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. He approached Virgil, who was sprawled on the ground, clutching his bleeding hand. The once fearsome leader of the gang now looked pitiful, his defiance replaced by fear and defeat. "You could have walked away, Virgil," Hank said, his voice carrying a note of sadness. "But you chose this." Virgil glared up at him, his lips curling into a bitter sneer. "You think this is over? You think taking me down changes anything?" "It changes everything," Hank replied, "because now people like you will think twice before coming after us." Eli emerged from the barn, his rifle still in hand but lowered. He hesitated for a moment before stepping closer to Hank, his expression a mixture of awe and determination. "Mr. Hank, what do we do now?" Hank glanced over his shoulder at Clara, who was keeping a watchful eye on the surrendered gang members. "We make sure they don't come back." "On it," Clara replied, motioning for the outlaws to move toward the fence line. "Get moving. And if I see any of you around here again, I won't miss next time." Virgil struggled to his feet, his injured hand cradled against his chest. "This ain't over, Hank," he muttered, his voice shaking. "You've made a powerful enemy." Hank took a step closer, his piercing gaze locking onto Virgil's. "No, Virgil, I've just made it clear that you don't mess with this family." With a resigned sigh, Virgil stumbled toward the fence line, joining his defeated crew. Clara kept her rifle trained on them, ensuring they didn't try anything foolish. Rusty barked loudly, his growl a final warning as the gang disappeared into the distance. As the dust settled, the tension in the air began to dissipate. Hank turned to Clara, a small smile breaking through his usually stoic expression. "Good work, Clara. You handled yourself like a pro." She lowered her rifle, a satisfied grin on her face. "Didn't have much of a choice, did I?" Eli approached cautiously, his rifle hanging loosely by his side. I think I hit one of them," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "I wasn't sure I could do it." Hank placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did what needed to be done, Eli. You stood up for what's right. That's what matters." The young man nodded, a flicker of pride crossing his face. He had proven to himself that he was stronger than he thought, and the experience had left an indelible mark on him. The group stood together in the fading light of the evening, the farm now quiet once more. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the land. Despite the chaos and destruction, there was a sense of peace settling over the homestead. A hard-won victory that would not be forgotten. Hank looked out over the fields, his expression thoughtful. "They'll talk about this, you know," he said, his voice low. "The town, the folks around here, word will spread." Clara chuckled, slinging her rifle over her shoulder. "Let 'em talk. Maybe it'll keep the next bunch of fools from trying something stupid." As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, the group retreated to the house. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the smell of Clara's cooking welcomed them, a reminder that even in the face of danger, life carried on. The farmhouse radiated a quiet warmth as the group gathered around the dining table. The comforting glow of the oil lamp flickered softly, casting shadows across the wooden walls. The tension that had gripped them earlier had given way to a collective sense of relief and accomplishment. They had stood their ground and protected their home, a testament to their resilience and unity. Clara set a steaming pot of stew in the center of the table, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "Dinner's ready," she announced, her voice carrying a rare note of lightness. Eli eagerly took his seat, his hunger sharpened by the day's events. "This smells amazing," he said, his tone filled with genuine gratitude. "Thanks, Clara." Hank, who had been silently tending to his revolver by the fire, joined them at the table. His movements were deliberate, each step heavy with the weight of reflection. He looked around at the faces of the people who had stood beside him: Clara, fierce and unyielding, and Eli, whose bravery had grown in the crucible of danger. "This family," Hank began, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "is more than just blood. It's built on trust, loyalty, and standing up for what's right. What we did today, it wasn't just about protecting this farm. It was about showing those men, and anyone else, that we won't be pushed around." Clara nodded, her jaw set with determination. They picked the wrong family to mess with, that's for sure. But it wasn't just them we showed. The whole town will hear about this, and they'll know we're not afraid to stand up for what's ours. Eli, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "I didn't think I had it in me," he admitted, his voice tinged with self-doubt. "But when it came down to it, I couldn't let them win. Not here. Not against us." Hank reached across the table, placing a firm hand on Eli's shoulder. "Courage doesn't mean not being afraid, Eli. It means doing what's right even when you are. Today you proved to yourself and to us what you're capable of." Eli smiled faintly, a flicker of pride breaking through his uncertainty. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged, not just as a helper on the farm, but as part of something bigger. As the conversation ebbed and flowed, the aroma of the stew mingled with the crackling of the fire, creating an atmosphere of comfort and resilience. Outside, the moon cast its gentle light over the farm, illuminating the scars of the battle that had taken place earlier that day. The windmill creaked softly, and Rusty's occasional bark punctuated the quiet, a sentinel watching over the homestead. Clara leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on Hank. "So what now? Think they'll come back?" Hank shook his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "They won't. Not after today. Virgil and his crew might be arrogant, but they're not stupid. They know better than to cross us again. And if they don't," Clara pressed. Hank's expression hardened, a glint of steel in his eyes. "Then we'll remind them, just like we did today." The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of his words sank in. It was a quiet, unspoken understanding. This family was prepared to do whatever it took to protect their home and each other. As the meal came to an end, Clara stood and began clearing the table, while Eli stoked the fire. Hank remained seated, his gaze distant as he considered the events of the day. The farmhouse had been their sanctuary for years, and now it was also a symbol of their strength and resolve. Before retiring for the night, Hank walked out onto the porch, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the warmth inside. He leaned against the railing, his eyes scanning the horizon. The faint glow of the town's lights flickered in the distance, a reminder that their actions would ripple far beyond the farm. Clara joined him a moment later, her arms crossed as she leaned beside him. "You think they'll remember this day?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "They'll remember," Hank replied, his tone resolute, "and so will we." Clara nodded, her lips curving into a small, satisfied smile. "Good." The two stood in companionable silence, their gazes fixed on the vast expanse of land stretching out before them. It was a place of hard work, sacrifice, and now undeniable triumph. They had faced down a storm and emerged stronger, their bond as a family fortified by the trials they had endured. This is more than just a story about defending a farm. It's about the strength we all have within us, the courage to stand up for what matters most. If this tale inspired you, hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories of resilience and triumph. Don't miss our next video. It's one you won't want to miss.